Ever stop and think about how often you're looking for something, but not like a specific thing?
Oh,
I'm not looking for that blue pen I always use.
right,
Just
yeah.
any pen will do.
Yeah.
Or my keys. Yeah, I just need my keys, Not any specific key on the ring.
Absolutely, yeah.
We do this kind of visual searching and sorting all day long
Yeah.
without even realizing it.
It's true. We don't often think about that. And in this deep dive, we're going to look at how we learn those categories of things.
Right.
Even how we visually search for them is tied to how we learn them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got this study,
Huh?
Explicit and Implicit Category Learning in Categorical Visual Search. It's from 2023 by Bohil and his colleagues.
Okay.
So what we're going to try to unpack today is how our brains actually learn to categorize things.
Yeah.
How those different learning styles affect how we search.
Right.
Like you said, how efficient we are at finding things visually and what strategies we even use.
Yeah, it's like bringing to light this process that's so fundamental to our lives, but
Yeah.
we rarely ever talk about it consciously.
Exactly. It's kind of amazing when you stop and think about it.
It is. So let's talk about visual search then. It's not just
Okay.
looking around randomly, it's
Yeah.
more like a two-part process.
Okay.
First, you've got your peripheral vision, that wider, less detailed view
Right.
that helps guide your attention to something that might be what you're looking for.
Okay.
And then once you've kind of honed in on it,
Yeah.
you use your foveal vision, the really sharp focused vision.
Right.
That's when you actually classify it.
Okay.
Is it what I want or is it something else?
Is this the target or just a distraction?
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
And this is happening constantly all the time until you find what you need.
So it's like our peripheral vision is doing a first sweep,
Uh-huh.
and then our fovea kind of swoops in to take a closer look.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is when we search for a category of things,
Right.
it's not like we have this perfect mental snapshot of one specific item in mind.
Okay.
It's more about our representation of the whole category itself.
Like when I'm looking for a pen,
Yeah.
I don't have like a picture of one specific pen in my head.
Right.
It's more like a general idea of what a pen is.
Exactly. In fact, the study says that categorical search
Okay.
is actually more challenging than searching for one specific image.
Which makes sense when you think about it.
It does, yeah.
It's like having a mental image of my pen.
Right.
You know, the one I always use?
Yeah.
That's a much easier target
Right.
than just the general concept of a pen.
Totally.
So how do we even develop these categories in the first place? How do we learn them?
Right. Well, the research here points to at least two different learning systems we have.
Two different ways of categorizing.
Exactly. One is called explicit learning. Think of this as the rule-based way to learn. Like you're consciously following a set of steps or instructions.
It's like learning a recipe.
Perfect example. Or learning the rules of a new board game.
Right, you're trying to apply those rules so you know how to play.
Exactly. And the brain is essentially trying out different rules to see which one fits best.
Which one gives you the most accurate categorization?
Precisely.
And then there's this implicit learning. This one sounds a lot more subconscious.
It is. It's like a slower, more gradual process of making associations.
Okay.
Sometimes it's hard to even put it into words what you've learned.
Like when you hear a song and you just know it.
Right.
But you'd be hard-pressed to name all the notes.
Exactly. Or recognizing someone's face but not being able to describe their features.
It's more about a feeling then, a sense of familiarity.
Yeah, a lot of times. And the study mentions these information integrating categories or 8-2 categories.
That's a categories.
These are the ones where there's no one simple rule.
Right.
Covers all the examples.
So you can't just rely on a simple checklist.
You got it. You have to kind of integrate different features almost subconsciously.
So it's the overall pattern rather than any one specific feature that defines the category.
That's a really good way to put it. Yeah.
So it's like with rule-based categories, you could sort books by genre.
Okay.
You have clear rules for what makes something science fiction versus biography.
Right.
But for information integration,
Yeah.
it's more like recognizing an artist's style. You take in all these different elements, the colors, the brushstrokes, the subject matter,
Yeah.
and you know it when you see it.
Uh-huh.
But it's hard to articulate a single rule.
That is a perfect analogy. So we've got these two different learning systems,
Yeah.
explicit and implicit. How do they actually affect visual search?
That is the question, isn't it? What did these researchers actually do?
Right. So they got clever. They trained people on new categories, like totally made up categories.
So nobody would have any prior knowledge or biases?
Exactly. They use these things called sinusoidal gratings.
Sinusoidal gratings, what are those?
Think of them like abstract visual patterns, sort of like blurry lines at different angles and thicknesses.
Okay, I can kind of picture that.
The important part is they were new to everyone. Nobody had seen them before. And they trained different groups using either explicit or implicit strategies.
So one group was given specific rules, and the other group had to figure it out on their own through trial and error.
That's it.
Without any explicit instruction.
Exactly. They actually designed the categories to be learned best in a specific way.
Okay.
So for the rule-based group, the categories were set up so you could figure them out by looking at independent features, like one feature at a time. But for the information integration group, the categories were based on integrating both features together.
Okay.
You couldn't just look at one thing in isolation.
So they really set it up to target those specific learning styles.
They did. They even had this diagram in their paper, Figure 1, I think it was. That showed how these categories were arranged in this abstract visual space.
Cool. So after people learned these new categories, what happened next?
Then they had to do this visual search task.
So find a target from one of the categories they just learned.
Exactly. But sometimes they were given a category label as a cue.
Like find the category A item.
You got it.
And sometimes they were shown a picture of the actual target.
Right. And all along they were tracking eye movements.
Wow. So they could see where people were looking, how long they look at each item, all that stuff?
Yeah, they got tons of data on how people searched.
This is so cool. So what did they find? Like, how did those different learning methods actually affect the visual search?
Well, one of the biggest findings was what they called transfer of learning.
Okay.
Essentially how you learn the category,
Right.
whether explicitly with rules or implicitly through association, that really determined how you classified items, even when you were just checking to see if you had the right target during the search.
That's interesting. So the way you learned it initially kind of stuck with you.
Exactly. As they said in the paper, the brain tends to stick with what it learned.
Makes sense. If you've already built a mental framework for understanding something, you're probably going to use that same framework when you encounter it again.
Yeah.
Is there anything in neuroscience that explains why that might be?
Oh, that's a good question.
Like, are there certain parts of the brain that prefer one learning style over the other? And once that pathway is established, it's just easier for the brain to stick with it?
That's a really interesting thought. I mean, this particular study didn't delve into the brain regions involved.
Right.
But there are theories that suggest that explicit learning, that rule-based kind of learning, might rely more on areas like the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in things like working memory and decision-making.
Okay.
Whereas implicit learning might involve more of those posterior brain regions. Areas associated with perceptual processing and long-term memory for associations.
So different parts of the brain for different learning styles.
Potentially, yeah.
And once those pathways are formed, the brain kind of defaults to them.
That's the idea. It's more efficient, you know?
Right. So this preference for the initial learning style, it had some pretty noticeable effects on how people actually performed in the visual search task, especially when they were given a category label instead of a picture.
Right. It's that speed versus accuracy trade-off they talked about.
Right. Okay, let's break that down. What happened with the explicit learners, the rule-based folks?
So those who learned explicitly, they tended to be slower overall.
Slower at finding the target.
Yeah, slower search response times. They also spent more time looking at both the target and the distractors.
So they were really taking their time examining each item.
They were, but even though they were slower, they were also more accurate.
So the careful deliberation paid off in terms of accuracy.
Exactly. They suggest that this points to a more deliberate, rule-based evaluation of each item.
They were double-checking everything against the rules they learned.
Right.
Okay, so what about the implicit learners?
Well, it was a different story for them.
Okay.
They were actually faster at finding the target.
So it's quicker search response times.
And their eye movements were more efficient, too.
What do you mean by that?
Well, their very first eye movement, that first fixation, was more likely to land right on the target.
Wow, so they were good at zeroing in on the right thing right away.
It's like their initial assessment, even in that less detailed peripheral vision, was better at guiding them to the target.
That's so interesting. So even before they focused in on the target with their phobia, something was already guiding them in the right direction.
Exactly. It's like the implicit categories they learned were triggering something even in their peripheral vision, helping them direct their gaze to the right spot.
That makes me think about those Where's Waldo puzzles.
Oh, yeah.
Like you kind of scan the whole scene with your peripheral vision first, and then something catches your eye. Some little detail that stands out.
And then, boom, your phobia goes right to it.
And hopefully it's Waldo.
Hopefully. But yeah, that's a great analogy.
So implicit learning was good for a quick initial guess.
Yeah.
Which led to faster overall search times.
Exactly. But here's the thing. When they gave people a picture of the exact target,
right, instead of just a category label,
those differences between the two learning groups basically disappeared.
So when you have a clear picture of what you're looking for, it doesn't matter as much how you learned the broader category.
Exactly. You're just doing a straighter visual match. And that actually tells us that the differences they saw with the category labels, those differences were really due to the mental representation of the category.
Not just something weird about the stimuli themselves.
Right.
This is always so fascinating. So what does this mean for, like, our everyday lives? It's not like we're walking around thinking, okay, I'm going to learn this category explicitly.
Yeah, it's not that conscious, is it?
Right.
But these findings actually connect to a lot of our everyday experiences. Think about searching for a document on your computer. Sometimes you use a very rule-based approach.
Like searching by file type.
Exactly. Or date modified.
Like, give me all the PDFs from last month.
You got it. You're explicitly defining the category with rules.
Right.
But other times, it's more implicit.
Like if I'm trying to find a song that matches a certain mood.
There you go.
I don't have a specific list of criteria.
It's more of a feeling.
Yeah, and I probably end up scrolling through tons of songs before I find something I like.
Exactly. And that's kind of the big aha here.
Yeah, what's the aha?
Our brains have these different shortcuts for learning.
Yeah.
And they affect even basic stuff like finding what we're looking for.
Right.
These different learning styles aren't just theoretical ideas. They actually change how we interact with the world around us.
It's really cool, but also kind of overwhelming to think about.
Yeah, I get that.
Like all this explicit versus implicit learning. What's the key takeaway?
I think the important thing isn't to consciously choose a learning strategy for every task.
Right.
But to just be aware that these two systems are always at play.
Okay.
And they influence how efficient we are and what strategies we naturally use in different situations.
So sometimes it might make sense to use a more rule-based approach, and sometimes it's better to go with a more gut feeling kind of search.
Right. Knowing that can be really helpful.
Okay, so big picture, what are the main points we should take away from this research?
Well, first off, both explicit and implicit learning are important.
Okay.
They both have their strengths when it comes to visual search.
Explicit
learning is all about accuracy.
Even if it takes a bit longer.
Exactly. You take your time to make sure you're categorizing things correctly. But implicit learning,
that's where you can get those faster search times.
Because your intuition can guide you more quickly.
That's it. Especially when that initial gut feeling is accurate.
This has been super interesting.
It really has. So, listener, here's a thought for you to chill on.
Okay.
The last time you were searching for something, anything at all, do you think you're using a rule-based approach or more of a feeling-based approach?
That is a good question.
Could understanding that difference change how you approach similar searches in the future?
It's definitely something to think about. And maybe we can all become more aware of how these learning systems are working in our everyday lives.
How they shape how we learn and how we see the world around us.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll catch you next time.
See you then.